Our go-to man on the airline industry, Miles van der Molen, CEO of CemAir, joins us now after the market leader in South Africa, Safair, claims that all airlines in South Africa overbook like they do. We'll find out if that's true or not. Miles, good to be talking with you. This story of overbooking, I've had experiences, I suppose many South Africans have when you travel internationally. I remember one night in Zurich being offered 20,000 Rand to give up my seat to take a later flight. And I grabbed it and took a later flight and was quite happily when I got home to be able to spend. In fact, I think it even paid for the whole flight. And it's not unusual. This happens internationally. But now we've got a debate in South Africa after FlySafair had some very angry customers that could not get onto a flight that they'd booked for. And it says, its statement was that everybody does it in South Africa. Now, you, CemAir, do you?
So, hey, nice to be on the show again. Thank you. It is done in some regions. Our reading of the Consumer Protection Act is that it's illegal in South Africa. And we certainly don't do overbooking on flights. And I know airlines come out with a statement that's similar to ours to say that they don't overbook flights at all. And that's our understanding, that it's not actually allowed. So for Safair to go out on a limb and claim that is very improper of them.
Explain why airlines overbook in the first place.
So there's a likelihood that some people won't show for the flights. They say, 3% of passengers won't arrive, so therefore we oversell by 3%. The aircraft will depart full, and effectively it becomes additional revenue. There are airlines, for example, like Lyft, that allows a lot of flexibility right up to the point of departure, so there'd probably be a slightly higher rate of churn there, because people are able to move their flights more easily. But my understanding, Safair's model is that it's 100% no-show, so effectively they are selling the seat twice, in my estimation.
How do you mean 100% no-show?
If you don't arrive for your flight, there's no refund available. So their stated position was, because some people don't arrive for their flights, that's lost revenue. That's not my understanding of their business model. They retain that revenue and then oversell the flight in addition to that.
So why would they make a statement of the type that you've mentioned to say that, well, everybody does it, even though you mentioned earlier that in South Africa this is illegal?
Why they admitted to overbooking. Why they would make a statement on everybody else's behalf is a bit of a mystery. But it's very inappropriate. So it's a lie. They should not have done that. It's crossing the line.
And why is it illegal in South Africa but not in other parts of the world?
I can't really speak to that. The CPA here seems to be clear that you can't oversell something oversell the capacity that you have. I think in Europe, and I'm no expert on the laws there, you can oversell, but the compensation you're required to offer is substantial, which is really what you experienced with your European story.
And similarly, in the United States, I recall being not stuck, but flying through Cincinnati, and there was a similar offer there of substantial amounts of money. It's almost like, well, they needed 10 seats. They were overbooked by 10 seats, and then they offered people the opportunity to cash in. And when nobody cashed in at $100, it went to $1,000 and then to a couple of $1,000. So clearly they take it very seriously there. Yeah,
absolutely. It turns into a bit of an auction, and that becomes the counterbalance. So it becomes very expensive for the airlines if everybody does arrive. Often it's legislated how much they would. The minimum compensation is legislated, and then it can go out from there. Whereas here, what we see is the airline in question being very rigid with their shut-off times at the check-in counter to make it, anybody that's marginal on their check-in time gets offloaded, and then that seat appears to be resold. I do recall a statement some years ago where they denied overbooking, but clearly this time they've admitted that this is a common practice.
Again, I've had personal experience with that. I remember some years ago flying in fact, that was the last time I attempted to fly a Safair, standing in the queue, waiting. It was a very long queue. and then being told that, sorry, the flight is closed, but you weren't told beforehand. So that was it. I had to find another flight later. So that's
Absolutely. So if you have a long check-in queue and the requirement is a check-in time, then you can manipulate the system to your advantage. So if you know the flight's overbooked, you can process the check-in at the required rate to get the outcome you want, which is not an ethical business practice.
This is now following on what our previous discussion was about the ownership of the airlines. It does appear as though there's some areas where FlySafair operates differently to the South African airlines. On the BizNews groups, there was quite a lot of sympathy for Safair, in that, well, it's a good airline, it operates efficiently, etc. Who cares who owns them? But on this overbooking story, I wonder if those same supporters would feel as generous if they were the victims of being overbooked and then not being able to get on.
Yeah, look, if it does affect your convenience, it will change your view on the airline. There's obviously a mounting number of matters that Safair is facing. Since our last conversation, the Domestic Licensing Council has also found them non-compliant with the ownership regulations. There is a matter before the Competition Commission that they're still facing. So it does seem that certainly at a commercial level, they have an interesting approach to following the rules.
Where does that come from, that at a commercial level? From the parents in Ireland?
It's difficult to say. I mean, obviously the onus is on the accountable manager, which is the CEO in this case, to make sure the organization conforms to local requirements. So, if your parent company tells you to break the rules, it's incumbent on the local management to uphold the law. It needs to be corporate responsibility and corporate accountability.
It feels almost like we've been in a Safair bashing session here at BizNews, but I struggle to get them. They write me off the record stuff, but I struggle to get them on air to give us their point of view. Miles, one of the things that does come out from people in the BizNews community is, well, if Safair were to pull out of South Africa, where would we be then? We wouldn't actually be able to. There wouldn't be the capacity to service the market.
At the moment, that is correct, but you can't have convenience above the law. If they aren't complying with the law, that has to be dealt with, and they need to conform. Yes, it would be a shock to the market. The market would take time to recover. But they have a dominant position because they have used tactics that they ought to not have. And the example I use is, if the mafia happened to own all the laundromats, you couldn't leave the mafia untouched because everybody would have dirty clothes. At some point, you have to say, what is right and has to be upheld. So yes, it would be an enormous shock to the market. They are a very large player. But if that's what the requirements are, they have to be followed.
So if I hear you correctly, they've just been breaking the rules and approaching the whole South African airline industry as, well, we'll do it the way we want to, and if we are called up, we'll say sorry.
Well, there's mounting evidence to suggest that's the case. So, certainly they've admitted to overbooking. That's not conjecture. And both councils have found that their ownership structure is improper, yes.
So what happens from here? What's the next step?
Oh, well, we'll see. I believe the NCC is investigating. I understand that they do take quite swift and decisive action. I understand that the Domestic Licensing Council is having a meeting this week to move that matter forward, and I'm not sure what's happening with the International Council. But we're in the hands of those government bodies that will make a decision on whether what action should be taken, and then the market reacts accordingly. And
what censure is there?
I understand in terms of the CPA, after there's fines are an option for the NCC. In terms of the licensing side, suspension of the license, fining, criminal charges. There's quite broad sanctions available to the council. It depends on what they choose to use as the tool in this case. There's no precedent on this, and no airline's been found to be wanting in this area before, so we've got no history to look back on. So this will be a trend-setting decision.
How long have you been running CemAir?
More or less 20 years.
And during this time, haven't there been times where you scratched your head to say, cheapers, this is a very difficult market to operate in? Because in the past you had predatory pricing, you had government subsidies, you've had just about everything that you can imagine. And now you've got a player, a foreign-owned player that's really operating according to its own rules. And I just got to ask you, why? Why is South Africa's air industry so abused, or or why are the laws or the rules so abused here? Because it's a very clear record.
It's a terrible record. And if you look at the number of airline failures over the last 30 years, it's a terrible number. I think I saw a government publication, about 30 airlines have started and closed. And not all of them were particularly well thought out, but some of them were very well thought out. So the industry's track record is a concern. Needs to build confidence. There needs to be corporate responsibility. It needs to be an industry that creates value, which it hasn't been either. So the industry needs to improve its footing, in my view. And the damage that SAFA is doing to confidence in the airline industry is substantial. We do hope the authorities will take swift action and publicly state a position, whichever way it is. So at least we all know where we stand, because the industry will do better for the public if it's a cleaner industry.
But why has it been allowed to be dirtied in this way over such an extended period of time? What blocks were ignored, or what laws have been ignored over this period?
There's a long period of skewing with state involvement and state subsidies of various players that didn't help. But I suppose I can't answer the question in China. I suppose each case you'd have to look on its own merits. But it's a record that one can't be proud of being in the industry.
But does the airline industry attract those kind of operators? If you were to talk about gambling, hotels and casinos and things like that, you'd almost say, okay, we know that there's a certain type of character who is attracted by that. Why would airlines, in particular in South Africa, have a similar record? I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this from a rational perspective.
Well, the numbers are very large, the turnover numbers are very high, and the margins are very small. So that does, if you look at SAFA, I understand that they admitted to overbooking by 1% to 2%. Don't quote me on that. In an industry where the margins are 3%, if you can make 2% by overbooking, it becomes very attractive. It becomes a sizable portion of your overall margin. We have seen with the Competition Commission some decisions taking a very long time before there's any kind of a penalty. And if there's a decade between the activity and the penalty, then that's no deterrent at all. So I guess one of the reasons why the industry hasn't conformed is it hasn't been held to the rules sufficiently. I mean, internationally, airlines are normally operated in a very clean and forthright manner. It's not, certainly in primary economies, we don't see airlines being questioned in this manner. But I suppose if there's no penalty for breaking the rules and it's profitable in a thin margin game, then guys will roll the dice. There's been a lot of upheaval as well, and maybe to an extent it becomes survival again because industry is not creating sufficient value.
So if I can just understand, getting back to the overbooking perspective, if you practice overbooking in the United States or Europe, as we mentioned on those personal examples, you better make sure that the person who you intend not having on the flight is adequately compensated. And eventually that might cost you a lot more than they would have paid you for the ticket initially, because that's part of the rules and regulations. So take a chance, overbook if you must, but know that the market is going to sort it out, in that if you overbook too much, you're going to be running unprofitable flights. In South Africa, if you overbook, you're breaking the rules, you're breaking the law. But is any compensation offered in the same way as it would be in the United States and in Europe? And indeed, if that is the case, do we have examples of that?
Well, there's no legislated compensation because obviously it's an illegal act, so that wouldn't be provided for. We don't do it, so I can't speak to that. And then what SAFAir's approach is, when the flight is oversold and everybody arrives and checks in on time, I'm not familiar with that, and perhaps they could, if they came on your show, perhaps they could cover that. But yeah, that is something I just don't have knowledge of.
Well, we have clarity on that. Then they operate, or their parents operate internationally, so surely that happens internationally, and then you just pay off basically the people who can't get on the flight. In South Africa, it's illegal. You can't pay them off because it's illegal. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for the people who are traveling. Miles, just looking forward, looking ahead to this, how this might all work out. How long would it be before there is some sanction, if any?
I understand the NCC moves fairly quickly. It is information that we have, so I suspect it won't be more than a couple of months. We do hope that SAFAir reconsiders their booking policy and only sells the seats they have, and we certainly hope that SAFAir stops publicly, assuming that we are complicit when we aren't. But obviously we have no control over that. But we would expect in the next couple of months for this to be determined, certainly confirmed, and perhaps a little longer for a penalty.
I have my own views on this, but why are airlines so heavily regulated?
Well, obviously, safety regulation is one aspect of it, and to keep the really fantastic level of safety that airlines around the world have proven over the years is important. Economic regulation is a slightly different subject, which this falls into. There's policies, and a lot of it is employment driven. Local ownership requirements, local value requirements, local employment requirements, simply to the benefit of the airline devolves to the community in the larger sense. So I think that's where the philosophy where a lot of these regulations and laws were born. Some jurisdictions you have seen it change and a relaxation. Others a strengthening of it. So it's very regional and it's fairly broad in that category. The approach is taken around the globe.
We know in South Africa we've got fabulous laws in many areas and they're just not enforced. Is it similar in the airline industry? I'm not talking about the enforcement, but the level of regulations in the South African airline industry, are they world class?
Certainly the safety regulation is world class, and there's a lot of consistency and standards around the globe. In terms of the economic regulation, I don't, some people might disagree with it, but there is a rationale for the laws that we have, and that they were well considered back when they were promulgated. Whether the enforcement of that, we will now see. So the two licensing councils have this matter before them, and how they approach it will determine how those councils are viewed into the future, whether or not they are seen as effective, or whether or not they give a slap on the wrist. It'll change how that institution is seen, I think. So this is really their time to shine, their time to put their foot down and demonstrate how the economic side of the industry will be operated into the future.
And as a participant, how would you react if it was just a slap on the wrist?
Look, if the laws aren't applied, then we would view it as not as a viable market, and we would look to downsize in the local market or extract completely. Society is a thing governed by laws, and if the laws don't need to be followed by certain players, and we would extract. There'd be no reason to participate that I could see.
Miles van der Molen is the founder and chief executive of CemAir. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.